Late-night hikers. What is the creepiest thing you have seen while hiking? Not hiking so much as car camping, but we were way out there in the middle of nowhere on BLM land in Colorado. We drove for an hour and a half down a Forest Service road and didn't see another soul. You could see headlights and hear cars from miles away from our campsite. It's not like somebody could have snuck up unnoticed. We had 3 cars with us and 8 people. We had just finished eating dinner, cleaned up, and as it was getting dark, we went back to the cars real quick before hitting our tents for the night. Somebody had slashed the front right tire on each of the 3 cars with what appeared to be a box cutter. Everyone thought it was a prank, but it became very apparent very quickly that it wasn't. All of us were beyond spooked, panicking, scary to watch spooked. We all had spares, and one guy had a gun, so we threw on our donuts while he literally guarded us, and we got out of there as fast as we could. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. Just knowing there was someone probably watching us, maybe wanting to harm us, makes me feel physically ill to this day. Edit. This was south of Gypsum, and it was 100% not private land. This was a marked Forest Service road in an area with dispersed camping I had visited several times before. There were 3 guys and 5 girls. The guys were all together, cooking the whole time leading up to us discovering the tires had been slashed. These people are my best friends, and this would be wildly uncharacteristic of any of them. For those wondering how we didn't hear it, our cars were parked about 30 yards away from our fire and tents, and a car coming down a road is easy to pick out from the sounds of nature. A gentle hissing gets lost in the wind. We heard it as soon as we started walking up. The tires were slashed in the exact same spot on the sidewall. It would be almost impossible for something on the road to puncture the tires like that. Also, there was no cell service. We called the cops and ranger as soon as we got back to the highway, told them exactly what FS road we were on, and gave them coordinates, but there wasn't much they could do. A cop told us it was good we were packing and to be careful out there. I often go out for walks very late at night, so I've seen a few things. The creepiest, though, happened about 2 months ago. I left the house around 1:30 a.m., and it started off as a normal walk. I wandered around town until about 2 a.m., when I decided to go home. I was walking back the route I had come when I noticed a black van meandering down the street. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. However, I did start to pay attention when I saw it slowly drive by me a second time. I wasn't entirely sure it was the same van, so I just continued walking. But this time, I kept an eye out. And lo and behold, about 10 minutes later, the same van came down the street again. This time, I knew for sure because it didn't have license plates. Now I was fairly scared, so I picked up my pace a little bit. When the van came around again, it stopped in the middle of the road a few houses in front of me. I stopped, turned around, and bolted in the other direction. I made a few turns onto different roads, and then ran right into someone's yard. I waited behind their fence, and the same van came down the street. I assumed that when they couldn't find me, they finally decided to leave. But I waited in that yard for about 20 minutes before I ran back to my house and practically threw myself through my bedroom window. It wasn't so much hiking as it was walking home after work one night, many years ago. I normally got off around 7 p.m., and my walks home were uneventful. However, that night I covered a half shift for someone and worked until 11 p.m. There was a trail behind some train tracks that I would take home to avoid walking beside traffic and whatnot. I came to realize that night those trails were a lot different at 11 p.m. than they were at 7 p.m. I happened across a guy who was lying by his bike, moaning in pain. It didn't sound like real moaning, more like a kid's fake, "I have a tummy ache and can't go to school" moan. I also noticed his bike was standing up on its kickstand. It didn't make sense to me that he would set his bike up properly, only to fall to the ground in pain. He saw me and called out to me for help, but I kept walking and turned to make my way back up towards the street. As I turned, I suddenly heard some shuffling around, and the previously hurt gentleman yelled at me, "I'm gonna kill you, jerk!" He hopped on his bike and started rushing towards me. At this point, I was most of the way up the incline, heading toward the railroad tracks that ran parallel to the street. I sprinted up there, and as I got over the tracks, my would-be assailant proceeded to hit the tracks with his front tire, flipping over his handlebars and hitting the ground hard. He was now moaning in pain for real, and making genuine calls for help. I used a payphone at a gas station to call the cops and explain what happened. They arrived, and the officer explained to me that this guy was a local troublemaker who pulled this kind of stunt to rob people. It wasn't the first time they'd had to pick him up after he crashed trying to rob someone. I told the officer that he had threatened to kill me, and he laughed. The guy wasn't even armed and apparently had been beaten up more times than he could count using that little line of his. Not on a trail, but walking my dog late at night. It was about 1 in the morning when my dog rang her bell, and I begrudgingly got up to take her outside. When she needs to pee in the middle of the night, I don't take her very far, just to our side yard. I took a flashlight with me in case she decided to poo so I could pick it up. I'm standing there waiting for her to do her thing, and she's doing the doggy walk in a circle routine. Then, all of a sudden, the dog gets spooked and whips around. Out of the corner of my eye, I see this chick just standing there. I didn't see her walk up. I didn't hear her walk up. I just see her standing there, super still. Based on her position, she had to have come from between my house and my neighbor's house, which is odd because our houses back up to a greenbelt. It's probably 40 degrees outside, and this lady, about 20, is in super short shorts and a t-shirt. I looked at her, told her she scared me, and she mumbled something like, "Nice night, what are you up to?" Standing there holding the leash with my dog, I said, "I'm walking my dog." Then she said, "Cool, cool. Do you know how to get into my house? I locked myself out." She pointed to my neighbor's house. Now, I'm a good American. I know my neighbors, and this wasn't my neighbor, who is a single 30-year-old female. She hangs out with my wife, so I know her really well. So I asked her, "That house?" while pointing directly at my neighbor's house. She nodded. I said, "You don't live there." "I know who lives there." She just scoffed and wandered into my backyard. I followed her and said, "What the hell are you doing?" She then took off running and scaled my fence, which, by the way, isn't an easy fence to scale. It's a deer fence. It's a see-through fence that goes up 3 feet with a cattle gate, and the top of the fence is stainless steel wire that runs horizontally. It's the type of thing that, if you weren't expecting it, you'd easily trip over because it's extremely hard to see and not very common. Anyway, she scales the fence and ran away into the greenbelt. I always carry a pocket knife, and I was fortunate enough to have my, unfortunately, useless dog. So I looked around my house and my neighbor's house for other people, shined my light in the greenbelt, and nothing. I have no idea how she wound up back there, what she was doing, or what she intended to do, but she scared the ever-living daylights out of me. Edit. Greenbelt, unincorporated land, zoned to never have anything built on it. I.e., backing up to the edge of a forest, cliff, etc. In my case, it's a wooded area for about 1 to a mile of nothing. Rattlesnakes, deer, mongooses, etc. live in that greenbelt. Edit 2. As an astute Redditor pointed out, mongooses and rattlesnakes don't coexist in any region in the world. It's Texas, and I've seen crazy stuff back there. Possums, roadrunners, owls, coyotes, bobcats, deer, regularly, lots of snakes, skunks, etc. I am not an expert on local fauna, so I guess Rikki Tikki Tavi doesn't live back there. I just know there are tons of thorns and assorted shrubbery that make it an awful place to chill. Common questions: was she hot? In a different context, maybe? As a creeper chick leaping deer fences like Jason Bourne? No. Is my neighbor a lesbian looking for something strange? No. She isn't a lesbian. Was it a meth head? This is my best guess. It was late, and she had the leaping abilities of a kangaroo. It was during the summer, around dusk, and I was camping at a remote campground with my dad. There was a lake right next to the grounds, and my dad and I would blaze a trail through the forest alongside the lake because, if you went far enough, there was a really pretty waterfall. A few strange things happened on this hike. We found a slash pile with a little kid's shoe on top. When we came to a small clearing, my dad had to take a leak, so he faced one side of the clearing while I faced the other. We both clearly heard a child say, "I'm over here." My dad thought it was me, and when he realized it wasn't, we spent half an hour searching for someone, but we found nobody. After that, We gave up on going to the waterfall and started making our way back to camp. But there were clear sounds of something following us, twigs snapping, bushes shaking. We haven't been camping there since. I was walking around my neighborhood alone once, enjoying the night air and watching the stars. There was this little pond near my house with a wooded area that had trees, a bench, and a rope swing that went out over the water. I sat down on the bench to look at the stars, and I heard some rustling off to my right, towards the trees. Bears were not uncommon where I'm from, so I took out my flashlight and shone it around over there. I didn't see anything. It freaked me out, so I kept my flashlight on and my senses aware, but I stayed on the bench to mull over my thoughts and watch the sky some more. I don't know why I did that, 'cause that's typical horror movie stuff. Anyway, a few minutes passed, and I didn't hear anything more, so I leaned back into the bench and started to relax a bit. I was staring up at the sky with my flashlight pointed downwards so as not to create any light pollution, when I noticed something in the tree in my peripheral vision. I couldn't tell what it was, but the branch was swaying slightly, and the rustling noise was back too. I immediately sat up and stared at it, but I hadn't shown my flashlight at it yet in case of pissing off some huge bird or something else. I don't think I've ever been that scared. I remember my heart was beating so fast and I could taste blood. I stared at it for what seemed like forever, and it slowly stopped moving. But the shape was still there. Bears do climb trees sometimes, so I was hesitant to run away in case that's what it was. So I just kept staring at it. After a while, I mustered up the little raisin-esque cojones to shine my goddamn light at the tree. It was a man. A freaking man. In the tree. Crouched in the tree like some silent naked monkey. He had no expression on his face, but his eyes were open really, really wide. When my light landed on him, he started to move like he was going to come down, but I didn't stick around to see if he did. I jumped the bench and ran for the hills. I ran to my house and around to the back door and locked myself in without looking back once. I went around and made sure every window and door was locked. I even checked the attic. I never go out alone anymore. Edit. I did call the cops, but they didn't find him, and nothing came from it. I was paranoid for months after that and started carrying pocket knives and/or pepper spray whenever I went out at night, even if I wasn't alone. Be safe, my dudes. I used to spend my summers bouldering with my friends by a relatively large forest about an hour and a half away from where I used to live. We often spent nights camping out there to save on travel costs and time. Anyway, I think this was roughly the third or fourth time we were out there camping. My friend had left all her climbing gear and her rucksack just outside her tent, or at least we definitely think she did. The next morning we found her boots, a few clothes, and all her chalk powder had disappeared. We figured it was entirely possible she misplaced them, although we were quite sure they were next to her tent. We didn't really want to believe they were stolen. Anyway, we didn't think much of it, and just foolishly told ourselves that maybe she left them by the boulders, and some animal took an interest in them. I know it sounds silly, but it seemed reasonable to us at the time. Fast forward a year, we're at the same spot as usual, sitting by the tents and relaxing after having some food. It's pitch black out, and only the camp area is lit by the fire. I step away from the group, out of sight, to relieve myself, and what do I see? A dude in a full-on ghillie suit lying on his stomach, looking right at our campsite. I froze as this guy realized I'd seen him, and he just bolted out of there. I don't know whether the event from the year before was related to the ghillie guy, but this has definitely stuck with all of us. We haven't been back there since, which is a real shame. Years ago, before we got married, my wife and I went to a local state park with a picnic and a hammock. We set the hammock up in the woods, enjoyed our picnic, and then fell asleep together in the hammock. I was abruptly awakened by my wife. She motioned for me to be quiet. The sun had set. There was still a hint of light in the sky, but we couldn't see anything meaningful in the woods. My wife beckoned me to listen. Complete silence. Then, the snap of a branch in the distance. More silence. We were both suddenly very on edge. We whispered to one another, trying to figure out if someone was sneaking up on us. The silence was broken again. Another branch, same direction but closer. Then, from another direction, a momentary crunch of leaves. Now, we were terrified. We both had pocket knives on us. Small, but better than nothing. We also had a flashlight. We drew our knives and deliberated whether whatever was out there knew our location. We decided to keep the light off, lest we give away our exact location. Maybe we could run for the car. More steps, in rapid succession, coming directly toward us, then silence again. My wife had enough. "We know you are out there," she yelled. Silence for an eternity, and then another crunch of leaves. We had enough. We prepared ourselves as best we could for a fight, then shined the flashlight into the darkness, toward the last noise we had heard. 3 deer scampered away into the darkness. We sheepishly gathered our things and left without incident. This wasn't on a hike, and it's pretty tame compared to some of these stories, but it's a bit similar. Back in our old place, one night my girlfriend and I were walking our dogs around the neighborhood. She's a lot smaller, so I was walking 2 of the dogs while she walked one, who was a former service dog. He was a real gentle dog, albeit a bit older. Other than snatching the ball away from the others during fetch, he'd never shown a hint of aggression. I walked a bit ahead of my girlfriend because of the 2 dogs pulling pretty hard on me, but not too far. Maybe 10 or 15 feet ahead, but around a corner. As I found out later, she'd slowed down in part because she'd noticed someone nearby acting strangely, scoping out a house, I think. When he spotted her, he said hi, and she responded in kind, asking how he was. Before he could answer, the dog she was walking started to growl, and she apologized, commenting that he was a guard dog. The guy looked at her and said, "Well, he's doing a good job tonight." She was pretty spooked and hurried to catch up to me. We were more careful on nighttime walks from then on. When I was younger and less wise, attending college in the North Georgia mountains, my friends and I would often go night hiking on the trails near campus. I became quite familiar with the area and with being out in the wilderness at night, which likely made me overly confident. One night, with the full moon shining and perfect weather, visibility was exceptionally good. Everything was bathed in a dim blue light. I was slightly stoned, feeling adventurous, and enjoying doing fun things alone, so I decided to go on a night hike by myself. I took a flashlight, but since this was around 2002, there were no cell phones. I chose a super easy trail that was mostly flat, maybe a mile loop, in a fairly secluded area, though not exactly a national park, very rural area. I didn't even need my flashlight for most of the hike. I walked in the moonlight, and it was a really cool and beautiful experience at first. At some point, I began feeling uneasy, and almost immediately, I heard a man's voice. It was coming from a distance ahead of me, somewhere off in the woods, maybe from the right side of the trail. He was crying. I'm generally an empathetic person, and 99.9% of the time, when I hear someone crying, I want to comfort or help them. However, this time, I felt a sickening panic in my stomach, if that makes sense. I remember almost calling out to him because my brain was telling me he might be hurt, which was the only reason I hesitated. But it was as if my body prevented me from speaking, and I knew I had to stay very quiet. He was sobbing as if he had just learned of a loved one's death, but was also babbling, like he was less than a person. There was a shrillness to his crying, as if he was holding back a scream, constantly, as if he had been doing it all night. I remember it vividly, and my spine is tingling even as I write this. It's hard to explain, but deep down, I knew he wasn't right in the head, and nothing good would come from him realizing I was listening. I retraced my steps. It felt like I had tunnel hearing, and the only sound in the world was that crying. I was hyper-aware of everything around me, paranoid that I might snap a branch or catch my boot on something. I worried that the man's crying would grow louder if I wasn't paying razor-sharp attention, getting closer, or turning into an enraged scream. Thankfully, it faded as I got further away, and I made it back to my car. Still, I was convinced that some wild-eyed hermit might rush out of the forest and attack me, right up until the moment I locked my doors and quickly drove away. I had the rest of my panic attack on the drive back. I managed to park back at campus and sat in the car to collect myself. Adrenaline is incredibly powerful. I have never felt a shred of guilt about leaving that man crying in the woods in the dark. I know I was slightly stoned, but slightly is the key word. I'm convinced to this day that I was in very real danger that night. Definitely not as extreme as most of the stories in threads like this, but sometimes I get that same sick feeling deep down, whenever I wonder what might have happened if the moon had been less bright, or if I had been more responsible and decided to use my flashlight even once. He would have seen me for sure. A few friends and I went on an overnight hike in the Rockies behind our little town a few years back when I was in high school. Our camping site was pretty far up, and it was getting dark. The spot we were at was nestled in a grove of trees, secluded from the wind and elements, so we decided to stop there for the night. The four of us built a little fire, ate dinner, and then just talked for a few hours. Suddenly, my friend leaped forward and doused the fire with our emergency water, plunging us into complete darkness. Needless to say, the rest of us were pretty upset as there was no reason for him to do this. He quickly shushed us, and we realized he was absolutely terrified, so scared he couldn't even speak or move. We managed to get a few words out of him, and he told us to look up on the ridge where we should have been camping. It was pretty far up, so it was kind of hard to see at first, but that sight will haunt me for the rest of my life. There was a fire, a big one, like a bonfire. Around the fire were several figures moving in a slow circle. They were humanoid, but not quite. They had arms and legs like people, but something just seemed different about them that I can't really explain. Almost like the limbs were too long and skinny or something, but maybe not. Anyway, these figures just moved around the fire in a really slow circle over and over again. One of my friends claimed he could hear them singing something, but I don't remember anything. Importantly, there was one standing off to the side a little ways, leaning with his arm on a tree branch above his head. It really creeped us out, but we were able to sleep it off. We figured it was a scout troop having a camp or something. Morning came, and we finished off our hike to the peak. On our way down, we passed the place where we saw the figures and decided to check out the camp. It was completely deserted. It was obvious that there had been a fire, and there were footprints everywhere. Inside the fire pit was a small mound of charred animal bones, probably chipmunk, and a pile of 4 or 5 rodent skulls that had been burned. Creepy, right? Then we looked over at where the one figure was standing. Blood. Not a lot, but enough to be of concern and definitely creepy. Then we saw the tree branch he was casually leaning against. It was well over any of our heads, and I'm over 6 feet tall. That would mean that in order for the figure to lean against it like he was, he would need to be at least 7 feet tall. Needless to say, we got off that mountain very fast, and I have never been up there again. We called the fish and wildlife rangers and told them what we saw. They said it was probably just a bunch of kids messing around and not to worry about it. It might have been just that, and we let our imaginations run wild, but all 4 of us swear to this day that we saw the same thing, and it didn't look like a bunch of kids in the dark. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but those mountains still scare the life out of me, and I will never go back there again. I went to an outdoor education boarding school when I was 14 or 15 in the Victorian Alps in Australia. We hiked the mountains in that area almost every weekend, usually doing 2 to 3 night hikes, sometimes longer. We had heard from teachers and locals that there were hermits in the mountains who lived in shacks or drifted between the old cattlemen's huts. We just brushed them off as silly stories the teachers told to spook us. However, there was one hike at the tail end of winter that made me believe there might actually be hermits living in the mountains. Basically, we were doing a 4-day hike at the end of winter, so it was extremely gloomy, foggy, and cold the entire hike. The Victorian Alps are famous for their cattlemen's huts, which are scattered throughout the high country. We would hike from hut to hut, but we rarely stayed in them, because it was one of the school's rules. On the second day, we were hiking on a steep ridge, and it was incredibly foggy and cold. You couldn't see into the valley, only down the sloping edges of the ridge. When you're hiking long distances, you don't really talk the whole way, and since it was miserable, we all had our heads down, walking straight. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a black dog about 50 meters down the side of the ridge. It wasn't a dingo, because it was jet black and had a collar on. It looked kind of like a border collie. I had only just registered that it was a dog when I swear I saw a man walking behind it. He looked disheveled and was looking up at us. Bear in mind it was really foggy, and this guy was darting in and out of the trees. I turned around and told my friend I saw a man and his dog on the trail below. He was still visible, so I pointed him out, and my friend freaked out a little too and told everyone else to look. By the time we got my group, 6 guys, to stop hiking and look, he was gone. Everyone other than my friend and I who saw him shrugged it off as a day hiker and his dog. We joked that it was a hermit but didn't talk about it much after. We arrived at our campsite, which was the Vallejo Gartner hut. We couldn't stay in the hut, so we set up camp on the flat ground around it. We set up, cooked dinner, and got ready to sleep. I didn't think much about the man and dog I saw earlier, but as it was getting dark, it kind of crept into my mind. There is this great toilet at the hut that overlooks the valley below. Honestly, an amazing view. It was almost dark, and I needed to use the toilet, so I headed there. As I was sitting and looking at the view, I felt a little creeped out, though I wasn't sure why. One thing to note is that these huts are all covered in scribbles and people's names and sayings, like literally every square inch is covered in something. So, of course, you never really read anything on the walls if you stay at these huts often. As I reached for the toilet paper, these words jumped out at me. Run, run, run. He's coming. Run. I never wiped faster. Combined with what I had seen earlier and my creepy feeling, I just bolted out of the bathroom and into my tent. The guy I was tenting with had also seen the man, so I told him what I saw in the bathroom. We both became pretty paranoid and just lay there for hours without making a sound. Eventually, I went to sleep. Things got really weird when the next day we woke up to find huge portions of our food missing. We kept the food in the outside part of our tents, in our hiking packs, and then inside zipped bags. Half of my group's outside tent flies were undone, with the packs open and food bags strewn on the ground. We initially thought it was a wombat, but the bags were literally unzipped, and our hiking packs had buckles to open them. My thinking was that the person I saw earlier was a hermit who followed us to our camp and stole our food at night. Honestly, it was the creepiest experience I've ever had. I was out taking my dog on a short walk and to go to the bathroom. She was a rescue and was, at this point, terrified of everything. So getting her outside was always a task. It was around 4 a.m., and she was whining at me. I figured she needed to go to the bathroom, so I put on some shoes and took her outside. It was a warm night since it was July in Missouri. As I was walking down the street from my apartment complex, I saw a figure standing under a streetlight, not moving. Thinking it was just someone out for an early morning run, I kept walking. That's when this figure started to move towards me in a strange manner. He wasn't jogging or walking. It looked like he was skipping. Thinking to myself, what the heck? I stopped walking. That's when my dog started growling from behind my legs. I had had her for almost 6 months and had never heard her growl or bark. I turned around and walked back into my complex. I looked over my shoulder, and this person was standing at the entrance to my apartment complex, dressed head to toe in black clothing, grinning from ear to ear. I was fully in a state of confusion and walked further into the complex while checking to make sure he wasn't following me. I started to head towards my entrance, and he turned and slipped away into the night. I went and talked to my landlord the next day, and she told me they had received multiple reports of this person skipping around the complex late at night, but whenever the police showed up, he was gone. Yellowstone National Park. I'm kind of an avid amateur photographer, and one night around 4 a.m., I was out alone in the Firehole Basin region of the park. The goal was to take a long exposure photo of a geyser erupting, with the Milky Way stretching through the sky overhead. The photo turned out to be pretty much a bust. When geysers erupt, they blow massive amounts of steam into the air, and steam kind of blurs that whole beautiful night sky situation. But anyway, I parked my car and hiked a ways to get close to the geyser I wanted to photograph. Then I set up my tripod, adjusted all the settings, and waited for the eventual eruption. The night was crystal clear, perfectly quiet, and very cold. As my ears grew accustomed to the lack of sound, I gradually realized I could hear the gentle burbling of the spring that gives birth to the Firehole River, some distance behind me. I could hear wind in the trees and leaves rustling across the ground. In front of me, I could hear rumbling and hissing from deep within the earth, as the white dome geyser worked itself up for another, inevitable eruption. An owl hooted somewhere above me, and I could even hear the distant howls of wolves across the bowl of the Midway Valley below. As my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, I could see the Milky Way stretched like a river of light from horizon to horizon overhead. 1,000,000,000,000 stars shined above, brilliant and cold. Orion hung over my right shoulder, and Venus burned just above the horizon, so bright it almost hurt to look directly at it. And then behind me, loud and sudden, the pounding footsteps of a giant, clearly coming right at me. Bear? Bigfoot? Some hideous creature, born in the hell of a geyser's boiling mouth, spewed upon the land to wreak vengeance? I didn't know, but I knew it was coming, and I knew it was close. The buffalo actually brushed against me as he went past. I was frozen in place, resigned to my fate. A huge bull, a mountain of fur and horns, shambling up out of the darkness, steam billowing from his nostrils in the cold, dry air. It felt like a close encounter with a freight train. He strode past like I didn't exist, seemed to tiptoe gently around my tripod, then stopped about 3 meters in front of me and took a long, slow, very satisfying, steaming piss on the ground. Then he grunted and went on his way. And I stood there wondering how I was going to take a photo if the geyser blew before my hands stopped shaking. This happened to me a few years ago. I used to go to school at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I'm a runner, and the campus is set in a beautiful redwood forest, so I would run on the trails. One day, I left a little later than usual for a run through one of the more isolated trails. Here's where it gets weird. I had been running for about 15 minutes, deep into the woods, and still hadn't seen anyone else around. Suddenly, up ahead, I saw what appeared to be a homeless man in ragged clothing walking on the trail. He was heading further into the woods, and this path extended very far, with the sun setting. This meant that the man was likely spending the night in the woods. I wanted to reach my usual running checkpoint before turning back, so I decided to keep my distance and run by. As soon as I passed the man, he called out to me. What came first, light or sound? In my head, I thought, this guy is odd. But I decided to humor him and yelled out, light, without looking back. He responded, well, I think it's sound, but who knows? And started mumbling to himself. I continued on. I reached my goal and started to head back. It was really dark now, and I was feeling uneasy about having to pass this guy again to get back. He seemed pretty disturbed and potentially dangerous, but I didn't have a choice. I passed the point where I had first seen him, but he was nowhere to be seen. There weren't any other branches of the trail, and if he had headed back, I would have seen him by then. He must have gone off the trail. Suddenly, a girl from up on a hill screamed for me to stop. I stopped and looked up the hill, but it was too dark to see anything. I was freaked out. I called out to ask if she was all right, and eventually saw her climbing down. The hill was really steep, so she had put in a lot of effort to get up there and away from whatever was after her. She said that she was on a run when a scary homeless man started harassing her and chased her up the hill, but she didn't know where he went. She was going to spend the night there until I came along because she was too scared to go back down. At this point, we both wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. Who knew if this creepy man was lurking around, watching us from the dark? So we ran back together and made it to the road. She thanked me, and we parted ways. I never ran on that trail again. Santa Cruz can be a pretty strange place. I've heard legends of students flunking out of school there, and then just living in the forest. Maybe this guy was a student from years past. My girlfriend and I had driven down an old dirt road that ran beside a lake on one side, with mountains on the other. We were looking for unexplored territory to hike in. The dirt road became a trail, and was eventually swallowed up entirely by the forest. Once the path became impassable by car, we got out and hiked for quite some time, before beginning our way back to the car as the sun was setting. It was a challenge getting the car turned around, but I finally managed, and we were off. It was slow going as it was a poor quality road and getting dark quickly. Suddenly, we came to a fork in the path that hadn't been visible from the other direction. Neither of us had any idea whether to go right or left, so I just picked randomly, hoping that both would end up taking us back to the main road. As we rounded a small curve in the road, Our headlights fell upon a man dragging a large hockey duffel bag off the trail into the woods. As soon as the lights hit him, he froze completely still. Driving past him felt like an eternity, because we couldn't have been going more than 5 miles an hour due to the poor road condition. My girlfriend and I didn't say a word to each other until we were well past him, at which point we were like, "What was that?" Then the road ended. Just like where we had stopped the first time, the forest had swallowed up this part of the road. We were going to have to turn around and drive past the man with the human-sized duffel bag again. I told my girlfriend to buckle up and hold on tight because, at the first sign of trouble, I was going to accelerate quickly. We came to the spot where the man was, and he was nowhere to be seen. We eventually made it to the right path and got out of there. The weirdest thing about it was that there wasn't a vehicle anywhere near this guy for 50 miles in either direction. We would have seen it if there had been. We'd traveled as far as possible in both directions, and there just wasn't any place to pull off the road. How did he get there? Where was he going? What was in the bag? I'd like to preface this by saying, I do not believe in ghosts. I was walking through the woods after fishing for the better part of the day. I decided to stay out real late and try to catch some bullheads from a local watering hole. I was only about 13 and stayed out way later than I normally would. Usually, I would take a trail home, but I decided to cut through some thicker brush to get to my grandparents' house so I could call my mom. I knew she'd probably be worried a bit, even though this happened from time to time. There was an abandoned graveyard on my route. I don't remember the story about it, but I knew it was there. I had wandered past it before, never really checked it out. It was all overgrown and wild. I knew that if I followed the outskirts of the graveyard, I'd hit the road and be home free. The day had been pretty chilly overall for a late spring day, but I swear, in my teenage brain, it was getting colder. I remember looking at my breath and thinking it was strange how cold it had gotten. It was overall a pretty bright night, near a full moon, but in the woods, it was hard to see. The graveyard was wide open, with no trees. It was well lit. As I was walking up, I noticed that the ground was covered in a thin layer of fog, and remember looking into the graveyard and not really registering what I saw at first. It was a person, which at first didn't seem odd, so I kept quiet and walked into the woods a bit more so I wouldn't get spotted. I didn't know who it was, so I wanted to keep clear. I stepped behind some trees and lost sight of them for a moment, and when I came back around the tree, they were gone. Weird, because I was behind the tree for maybe a few seconds at most. I didn't hear anything either. I walked a bit further, keeping an eye out. I was a bit creeped out. Near the graveyard was a rundown barn? I'm not really sure, but as I got closer to it, I could see that someone was inside. I got a good look, and it was a woman, probably in her 50s. The way the moonlight hit her made her look incredibly pale. She seemed to be digging, but I didn't hear anything. No sounds of a shovel or her making noise in any way. I was maybe 30 feet away. I could see she stopped and disappeared behind some debris. I decided to get out of there quickly and move to get to the road. I tried to keep track of her, looking for where she went, but I couldn't find her. It was like she literally disappeared. I kept walking and came out to the road. The fog was pretty much covering the road, a small country road, with fields on one side and woods on the other. As I walked down the road, she would randomly appear behind and in front of me, and I started hiding and basically playing cat and mouse. Each time I saw her, she was hard to see, only in the moonlight, and stuck to the remnants of some of the old houses nearby. She always looked pale and never made any noise. Once I got past that part of the road which had a number of barn foundations and home remnants, I never saw her again, and it instantly started getting warmer. It creeped me out, and I never went that way again. I don't know who or what that was, but I told my uncle about it, and he went and checked it out, thinking maybe someone was trying to excavate the graves. He said there wasn't anything messed with. They thought I was lying. It still gives me the shakes just typing this out. I know it was most likely someone wandering around looking for stuff or checking the place out. But what teenage me remembers didn't seem natural. It was also weird that she never made noise. She also seemed to be able to just appear and move around me. At one point, she was right behind me, and I swear a moment later, she was in front of me. Years ago, a friend stopped by from out of town and brought a hefty dose of LSD with them. It was a beautiful summer night, so we dropped a few tabs and decided to go for a hike. A half-mile from my house is a river with a trail leading through the woods to a cemetery. In high school, there were always stories of Satan worshippers using this cemetery, and tales of a witch's grave. There are also creepy cairns spaced out in the woods behind the cemetery. I've walked through the place many times and never seen anything suspicious, just a peaceful place to spend some time. I found the supposed witch's grave, though. Just another grave to me. Anyway, with our heads full of acid, we were heading up the narrow path leading to the cemetery in the dark when, out of nowhere, about 8 hooded figures walked past us in the opposite direction. We never heard them coming. One second they were there, the next they were gone. They didn't look at us or say anything, just walked past with their heads down. My buddy and I gave each other the old, "what the heck" look, shrugged, and continued on. We made our way through the woods into the cemetery and started to peek. It was fully dark now, and we were walking down one of the side paths, trying to find the witch's grave, which was proving difficult considering the trip and the darkness. Suddenly, 100 feet or so ahead of us, multiple lights sprang into being, maybe a dozen of them, and just hovered. We stopped immediately, looked at each other, and confirmed that we were both seeing this, and it wasn't just a hallucination. And then, as we watched, freaked out, they very abruptly scattered in all directions, disappearing into the cemetery. Time to go. We did an about face and started double timing it toward my place, keeping our heads on a swivel. For the first couple of minutes, there was nothing. Then randomly, off in the woods, we'd see a single light flash on, only to disappear seconds later. Then a few more. Sounds of running and heavy breathing were coming from the woods. They were all around us. We walked faster and faster, no longer caring about what was happening, just wanting to get away. I tried to think through the acid, but all I could come up with was that the Satan worshippers had summoned the alien overlords, and I was pretty sure we were going to be sacrificed to them at any moment. We turned down the final path out of the cemetery. I could see the gates and the street beyond, and I started thinking we might actually make it out. Then a dark hooded figure stepped out from behind a mausoleum to our left, and a brilliant light blinded us. It was a man. In a solemn, deadly calm voice, he said, "You're it." We were frozen. No idea how to proceed. Finally, my buddy stuttered, "What?" "You're not with us, are you?" the man replied. No man, we're not with you." He lowered his hood. It was a kid. Like a teenager, but still, just a kid. Turns out he was playing flashlight tag with his buddies. He apologized in his manly voice for bothering us, turned off his light, and ran back into the cemetery to rejoin his friends. So yeah, that was a fun night. I was hiking one night with my wife in an urban wilderness area of our hometown. It's essentially a large section of the city that's uninhabited, owned by the city parks department, and turned into hiking and biking trails. We arrived at dusk one evening, and there were no other cars in the parking lot. We began our night hike, and about 45 minutes in, it was pitch black. As we were hiking down a trail, we turned a corner and heard a very low, unnerving growl. We immediately stopped, and I shined my flashlight in the direction it came from, about 5 yards away. We couldn't see anything. We stood there for a few moments to see if we could hear it again, and sure enough, it got louder. It sounded deep and large, almost like a lion growling at us. It was very startling. We never saw anything but ended up booking it in the opposite direction, literally sprinting back to the parking lot. I've never run so fast. After getting back to the car and gathering our wits, we heard distant motorcycles driving down the road. They sounded similar to the growl we heard. I tried making sense of it. Was it the motorcycles or an animal? The only native animal large enough to make a deep growl like that would maybe be a mountain lion. We don't have any other large animals around here capable of making that sound. I know there are a few mountain lions here and there in the surrounding rural areas where I live, but in city limits? No way. I'm still baffled by it.